The morning Margaret died, our 3 children didn't wait for the dirt to settle on her grave before they showed me exactly who they were. It was a Tuesday in April, 2 weeks after we buried her in the Dandenong Ranges, where she had always said the light came through the trees like it was apologizing for something. I had driven myself to the solicitor's office in Hawthorn, parked my old Holden ute in the same spot I always used when Margaret and I would come in together for the annual review of her family trust. I walked through the glass doors alone for the first time in 43 years of marriage and sat in a chair that suddenly felt 3 sizes too large. My name is Raymond Clifford. I am 67 years old, retired structural engineer, and on that Tuesday morning, I became a stranger in the story of my own life. Natalie was already seated when I arrived. 51 years old, a property developer from Brighton, wearing a charcoal blazer that probably cost more than my first year's salary. She didn't look up from her phone. Beside her sat Dominic, 49, who ran a finance consultancy in the CBD and had my wife's eyes but none of her warmth. At the far end of the table, Owen, 46, the youngest, tapped a silver pen against the glass surface in a rhythm that made my back teeth ache. Their solicitor, a thin man named Gerald Ashworth, cleared his throat and opened a leather folder. Margaret had built her estate across 40 years in corporate law before she retired. The Clifford Family Trust held assets worth just over $14 million, 3 investment properties in Melbourne's inner suburbs, a share portfolio, a term deposit, a commercial property in Geelong that had been generating steady income since 1998. Gerald read through the primary distribution in a voice that had clearly delivered difficult news before and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. Everything went to the 3 of them. Every property, every share, every cent. Then Gerald slid a small envelope across the table toward me. I stared at it the way you stare at something that doesn't make sense yet. A white envelope, unsealed. My name written on the front in Margaret's handwriting. Inside was a single folded note, and, when I shook it gently, something hard slid against the paper. I reached in and found a small brass key attached to a worn leather tag. On the tag, in Margaret's precise hand, were 4 words, Phillip Island. Natalie leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. She told me that Mum had always been clear that the Clifford assets were hers by birthright, not mine, that I had been generously housed and provided for during the marriage, and that the estate was now being managed by the family. Dominic added, without looking up, that the house in Balwyn had already been listed for sale, and that I would need to arrange somewhere else to stay by the end of the following month. Owen didn't say anything. He was already on his phone. I sat with the key in my palm, the brass cold and slightly tarnished, and I looked at the 3 of them children I had coached through homework at the kitchen table, driven to Saturday sport in the rain, taught to change a tire on a Sunday afternoon in the driveway. I thought about the 32 years I had spent as their stepfather, cooking breakfasts before school, attending their graduations, watching their weddings from the second row, because the first row was reserved for blood relatives. I put the key in my shirt pocket. I thanked Gerald for his time. I walked out to my ute, sat in the driver's seat for a very long time, and then I drove south toward the coast. If you have ever held something in your hand that you don't yet understand but know with absolute certainty will change everything, then you know how that key felt against my chest for the entire 2-hour drive down the South Gippsland Highway, Phillip Island. Margaret and I had spent the first summer of our marriage there in 1982. She had rented a weatherboard shack near Cowes, while I was finishing a bridge project down the coast. After that, she would disappear to the island every few months, what she called her thinking weekends. She would come back quieter, steadier, more herself. I never asked questions. I trusted her. I had not been to the island in nearly 20 years. I pulled off the main road at Rill and drove down a gravel track I almost missed. the she-oaks pressing close on either side, their branches dragging across the roof of the ute like fingers. The track ended at a gate, old timber, solid, with a brass padlock that matched the key exactly. The lock opened without effort. It had been recently oiled. Beyond the gate, a narrow driveway curved through coastal scrub for perhaps 300 meters before opening onto a cleared block facing the strait. The building that sat there was not a shack. It was a single-story workshop built from recycled hardwood and stone, low to the ground, with deep veranda overhangs and windows that faced the water. Beside it, a small cottage, perhaps 3 rooms, neatly maintained, with a vegetable garden running along the south wall. Standing at the workshop door was a woman of about 75, silver hair cut short, wearing work boots and a canvas apron dusted with what looked like sawdust. She had the kind of face that has decided it is done pretending. She told me her name was Judith Mara. She said she had been waiting for me, and that Margaret had told her I would come when the 3 of them finally showed their hand. I asked her how long she had known. She said she had known Margaret since 1984. For 40 years, Judith had been the keeper of this place. She unlocked the workshop and walked me inside without ceremony, the smell of timber oil and old paper rising around us in the cool air. 3 walls of the workshop were lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelving. On those shelves, arranged in chronological order, were identical green binders, each one labeled with a year and a month in Margaret's handwriting. Beside the shelving, a timber desk held a laptop, a printer, and a second sealed envelope with my name on it. I looked at the spines of the binders. The earliest was dated July 1986. There were hundreds of them. I picked up the envelope from the desk and broke the seal. I should tell you that I am not a man who cries easily. I spent 30 years calculating load tolerances on structures designed to carry weight that would break ordinary materials. I have always believed that you look at things as they are, not as you wish they were. But sitting in that timber workshop with the sound of the strait outside and Margaret's handwriting in front of me, I cried before I had finished the first paragraph. She began the letter by telling me she was sorry, not for what she had done, but for what she had been forced to become. She wrote that the plan to remove me from her life had not originated with our children. It had been engineered years earlier by her first husband's parents, a couple of extraordinary wealth and matching cruelty who had never accepted that Margaret had remarried. They had spent years whispering into Natalie's ear, "You are a Pemberton, not a Clifford. He is not your father. He married her for the money." When Natalie was old enough to believe it, she had passed it to Dominic, and Dominic had passed it to Owen. And by the time our children were adults, the story had calcified into something they treated as fact. Margaret had discovered this in August 1986 at a family dinner when she had gone to refill the wine and overheard Natalie on the back veranda talking to her grandmother on the phone. She was 16 years old, and she was describing, in precise detail, a plan to have me assessed by a doctor who would certify diminished capacity, which would then be used to challenge any changes Margaret made to the trust. They had been planning this since before I understood there was anything to plan for. Margaret wrote that she had stood on that veranda for a long time before going back inside. She poured the wine. She laughed at the right moments. And she began building the thing that would one day save me. 1 month at a time. Some people protect the ones they love by standing in front of them. Margaret protected me by making sure no one knew I was worth protecting. She withdrew me from the trust documentation. She kept me out of corporate events. She stopped introducing me as her husband in rooms where it mattered. She allowed the children to believe their whispers had worked, that she too saw me as temporary. Every month, she came to this island and wrote me a letter. She explained every decision, every cold dinner, every weekend. She had insisted on going away alone. Every time she had corrected me in front of the children and watched me absorb the humiliation without understanding it. She wrote it all down. 1 month at a time, in those green binders. I made you invisible, she wrote, because visible men get hurt by invisible enemies. I am sorry it cost you so much. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I reached for the July 1986 binder. I am not going to tell you it was easy reading. It was not. It was 40 years of your wife's life laid out in careful detail, and woven through every page was the knowledge of how much she had sacrificed to keep the machinery running quietly around me. The first entry described the veranda conversation in her own words. Her shock, her grief, her calculation. Within 3 months, she had hired a private investigator to document the Pemberton grandparents' communications with Natalie. Within a year, she had engaged a separate solicitor, Gerald Ashworth's predecessor, and begun a parallel legal structure that existed entirely outside the family trust. I opened the 1993 binder and found a photograph clipped to the January entry. It showed my car parked in the driveway of our Baldwin home, driver's side door open, with what was clearly visible even in a grainy photograph as a deep scratch running from the rear wheel arch to the front bumper. I had always assumed I had done it myself, reversing out of a tight car park. The photograph was accompanied by a report from her private investigator confirming that Dominic, then 17, had been seen walking past the car with a key in his hand at 6:15 in the morning. Margaret had not confronted him. She had filed the report in the binder, paid the panel beater, and said nothing to me. I sat with that for a moment. 17 years old. My car. A key. I opened the 1997 binder and found something that made the workshop feel very cold very quickly. A typed document, 3 pages, bearing the letterhead of a psychiatrist in Turak. A referral request, completed and signed, with my name in the patient field and a description of symptoms I had never displayed. Confusion, memory lapses, erratic behavior, difficulty managing finances. The referring physician's name was one I did not recognize. The document had never been submitted. Attached to it was a note in Margaret's handwriting, explaining that she had intercepted it from Natalie's bedroom during a school camp weekend, photographed every page, replaced it, and then arranged for the psychiatrist in question to receive, anonymously, a detailed complaint to the medical board. The referral was never sent. The psychiatrist retired the following year. Natalie had been 22 years old. I turned pages slowly now, my structural engineer's mind cataloging failures the way I had once cataloged cracks in concrete. Not one dramatic collapse, dozens of small stresses, each one tested, each one quietly reinforced before it could widen. In 2003, Dominic had convinced Margaret to add him as a co-signatory on a business account by telling her it was for operational convenience. What he had not told her was that he had already arranged for a loan application in my name, forged signature, my date of birth, my Medicare number through a third-party broker who did not look closely at paperwork. The loan was for $60,000, secured against nothing. Margaret had discovered this when the broker, unaware of who Margaret was, had called the house to follow up. She had paid the broker to shred the application. She had kept a copy. She had framed the copy in a document sleeve and placed it in the 2003 binder. And she had made Dominic believe, for the next 20 years, that she had never known. How does a woman hold that kind of knowledge across 2 decades at the same dinner table? I genuinely do not know, but the green binders showed me she had done it. Month after month, her handwriting steady and precise, her reasoning always the same. If they know I know, they will find a worse way. There was one entry I read 3 times before I fully understood it. In 2009, I had been diagnosed with high blood pressure. My GP at the time had prescribed a daily medication that I took every morning with breakfast. A habit so unremarkable, I had long since stopped thinking about it. What I had not known, what I could not have known, was that in early 2010, Owen had been making regular visits to the house while I was at work. He had a key. Margaret had been at her office. The housekeeper who worked for us 3 days a week had, it emerged from Judith's files here on the island, been approached by Owen and offered a cash payment to look the other way on certain mornings. The 2010 binder contained a laboratory report. Margaret had arranged, through a chemist she trusted on the island, to test the contents of my medication bottle. The analysis showed that approximately 40% of the capsules in the bottle had been replaced with an inert compound. Not enough to be immediately dangerous. Enough, over time, to allow my blood pressure to trend upward without obvious cause. Enough to produce a stroke on a slow timeline that no one would question in a man approaching 60. Margaret had replaced every capsule herself. She had sourced my correct medication through the island chemist for 2 years without the household supply being touched. She had arranged for Owen's key to the house to be covertly changed, and she had sat across from him at Christmas lunch, poured him a beer, and asked about his work. I put the binder down and walked outside. The strait was gray and flat, the wind coming off the water at a low angle. I stood on the veranda for a long time. Judith came out eventually with 2 mugs of tea and sat in the second chair without being asked. She did not say anything comforting. She just sat there, which was exactly right. I told her I needed to understand something. I told her that Margaret had known, for at least 25 years, that these 3 people were systematically trying to harm me, and I asked why she had not simply told me. Not once in 43 years had she said, "Ray, I need you to know what's happening." Judith looked at the water for a while before she answered. She said that Margaret had explained it this way. If Raymond knows, he will confront them. If he confronts them, they will know the evidence exists. If they know the evidence exists, they will find a way to destroy it, discredit it, or escalate. The only weapon she had was their certainty that they were winning. The moment they suspected otherwise, the whole architecture would collapse. She turned me into the protected piece on the board, Judith said. By making sure I never knew I was in the game, I went back inside and opened the laptop. Margaret had left instructions in the letter for accessing a directory of digital files. The directory contained, among other things, a series of video recordings made on this property over the past decade. The camera was mounted in the workshop eaves and had motion activation. Most of the recordings were of Margaret working at the desk, writing in the binders, occasionally speaking aloud as she worked through a problem. But one recording, dated 14 months ago, showed a different visitor. Natalie had come to the island alone. She had found the gate, I do not know how, and she had driven up the track and walked around the outside of the buildings for nearly 20 minutes. She had tried the workshop door, found it locked, peered through the windows. The camera quality was good enough to see her face clearly. She had left without getting inside. She had never told her siblings about this visit. Margaret's note on the recording was brief. She found the gate but not the key. She will wait to see what the will produces. Watch her carefully after. I understood then that Margaret had been watching all of them right up until the end. And she had been watching me too, not with suspicion, but with the kind of attention you give to something you are determined to protect. The directory also contained a folder labeled Legal Final Structure. Inside was documentation for an entity I had never heard of, the Raymond Clifford Conservation Trust. Registered in 2019 inches, my name alone. Assets. This property on Phillip Island, comprising 6.5 acres of coastal land, the workshop, the cottage, and an adjoining block, Margaret had purchased quietly in 2021. Market value, according to a recent independent appraisal, just under $2 million. Additionally, a managed fund with 32 years of accumulated deposits, currently sitting at just over $900,000, and a life insurance policy, fully paid, beneficiary listed as Raymond Thomas Clifford, worth $1.2 million. Margaret had been building this for 3 decades, diverting personal bonuses, income from consulting work done under a separate ABN, small amounts monthly that would never trigger review. Every cent of it was legally mine, predating the family trust by years, entirely separate from the Pemberton estate structure, untouchable by any challenge the children could mount. They had taken $14 million and a house in Baldwin. She had left me $3.2 million and a coastline. I sat with that for a long time. Then I opened the final section of the letter. Margaret had written it in a different hand, slower, less certain, the pen pressing harder, as though needing the resistance. Her illness had progressed by the time she wrote this part. She told me that the locked box in the workshop's bottom shelf, the one I would find when I was ready, held copies of everything. Every laboratory report, every forged document, every photograph, every private investigator's summary, every covertly recorded conversation, of which there were more than 40, spanning 3 decades. She had also prepared a statutory declaration, witnessed and notarized, describing in full the chronology of events as she understood them, signed by her in the presence of Gerald Ashworth's predecessor and Judith Mara. This material had been lodged with a separate legal firm in Geelong on automatic release to the Victorian Police Financial Crimes Unit and the Consumer Affairs Office in 60 days, unless I logged into the system and entered a code to pause the release. They had 60 days, whether they knew it or not. She ended the letter the way she had always ended things, quietly and without drama. She wrote that she had loved me from the first conversation we ever had, standing in the car park of a hardware store in Nunawading in 1979, when I had helped her load a sheet of plywood into a car that was clearly not built for it. She wrote that loving me had been the easiest thing she ever did, and protecting me had been the hardest, and she was sorry that the two had required such different faces. "I will be in the workshop with you," she wrote. "I have always been in the room, even when you thought I wasn't." I closed the letter. I sat in the chair Margaret had sat in for 40 years, looking out at the same gray water she had looked at, and I let myself understand fully what she had spent her life building. Then I picked up my phone and called Gerald Ashworth. Gerald, to his credit, sounded genuinely unsettled when I described what I had found. He had been Margaret's solicitor for 11 years. He had not known the full extent of the parallel structure. He had known something existed, but Margaret had been careful to keep the details distributed across enough separate entities that no single person held the complete picture. I told him I was not asking for his opinion on what to do. I was telling him what was going to happen. I was going to give the 3 children 28 days to meet with me on this property, after which I would make a decision about whether to pause or allow the release of Margaret's legal package. Gerald said he thought that was a reasonable approach. I said I was not asking him whether it was reasonable. There was a short silence, and then he said he would make the calls. They arrived on a Saturday morning in May, all 3 of them in Natalie's Range Rover, driving up the gravel track with the same expression people wear when they are trying to look like they are not worried. Natalie got out first, scanning the property with her developer's eye, and I watched the moment she registered that this was not a broken-down weekender. Dominic followed, then Owen, hands in his jacket pockets, still tapping something against his leg. I was sitting on the workshop veranda. I had made no special preparations. There was no dramatic staging of documents, no performance. I had simply laid 3 folders on the table beside me and made a pot of tea. I did not stand up when they arrived. Natalie started speaking before she reached the steps. She said something about wanting to discuss Mum's wishes in a civilized way, about how things had become confused at the solicitors, about how the family should be thinking about what Margaret would have wanted. I let her finish. Then I told her that Margaret had spent 30 years documenting exactly what she wanted, and that copies of that documentation were currently with a legal firm in Geelong on a 60-day timer, and that 28 of those days were already gone. The silence that followed was the most honest thing I had heard from them in years. I walked them through it without theater. The forged loan application with Dominic's fingerprints on the broker relationship, the medication tampering in 2010, with Owen's name on the housekeeper's statement, the referral document from Natalie's bedroom in 1997, photographed and filed, 43 recorded conversations across 3 decades, a statutory declaration from Margaret describing the full history, witnessed and notarized. I told them I had no interest in a court case. Courts take years, cost money, and produce outcomes no one controls. What I had was something more direct. I was their creditor now. I had documentation of fraud, attempted harm, and financial misconduct. I could allow the release to proceed, or I could choose not to. That choice depended entirely on what happened in the next 32 days. Natalie asked me what I wanted. I told her I wanted 3 things. First, the Baldwin house was to be removed from the market immediately and transferred back to my name. It had been our home for 31 years. I intended to continue living in it. Second, Dominic was to engage, at his own cost, a forensic accountant to identify and return to the Mara Clifford Trust any funds that could be traced to the forged loan application or related transactions. Gerald Ashworth would oversee the process. Third, Owen was to present himself at a community legal center of his choice and commit to 80 hours of voluntary paralegal assistance for people navigating elder abuse matters. I had already identified 3 centers in Melbourne that would accept him. He would start within a month. I looked at each of them in turn. I told them that Margaret had not built this to punish them. She had built it to protect me, which was the only thing she had ever wanted to do. But she had also built it knowing that the only way they would ever become the people she had hoped they could be was if they faced what they had actually done, without the protection of her silence around them. Owen was the first to speak. His voice, when it came, was smaller than I had ever heard it. He asked me if Mum had known about the medication, about all of it the whole time. I told him yes. He sat down on the veranda step. He put his head in his hands. Dominic stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, that he had told himself for years that I was the reason the family felt fractured, that I was the outsider who had disrupted something that had been whole before I arrived. He said the Pemberton grandparents had given him language for a feeling he already had, and that he had used that language without ever questioning where it came from. He did not ask for forgiveness. He just said it, plainly, like a man reading a verdict on himself. Natalie was the hardest. She is the oldest and the most guarded, and she had built the most elaborate scaffolding around what she believed. She stood on the gravel for a long time without speaking. When she finally looked at me, I could see something shifting beneath the surface, slow and resistant, like ground frost breaking up. She asked me, in a voice that had lost most of its hardness, whether I had ever actually wanted to be their father. I told her the truth. I told her that when I married Margaret, I was 30 years old and those 3 children were the most important people in her life, and so they became the most important people in mine, not because I was obliged to, but because that is what you do when you love someone completely. You love what they love. She looked away. She nodded once, very slightly. We did not hug. We did not reach any kind of resolution that afternoon that you could fit into a single conversation. These things take longer than that. And I am old enough to know the difference between a door opening and a relationship being repaired. But the door opened. Judith served tea, and nobody left until well after dark. In the months that followed, I watched 3 people begin the slow, difficult work of becoming who they might have been if someone had caught this earlier. Owen's paralegal work turned, after 2 months, into something he went back to voluntarily after his hours were complete. He told me, standing in the vegetable garden one afternoon while I was working on the raised beds, that he had not realized how many people were navigating situations that looked uncomfortably like ours. Dominic's forensic review turned up more than either of us expected. He did not minimize it. He had the report delivered directly to Gerald Ashworth and then called me himself to tell me the total. He sounded like a man who had just had a long look at his own structural plans and found them wanting. Natalie listed 3 investment properties for sale. Not because I asked her to, because, as she explained in the kind of short, practical email that is her natural register, she had decided that the things she had spent her life accumulating had not actually made her feel secure, and that she wanted to try a different approach. I moved back into the Baldwin house. I planted a Japanese maple in the back garden, in the spot where Margaret had always said she wanted one but never got around to. I drive to the island most weekends and sit in the workshop, and sometimes I read from the binders and sometimes I just look at the water. Judith and I have started a small project together, converting part of the island property into a retreat for people in elder abuse situations, a place where they can have time and space to understand what has happened to them and begin to plan for what comes next. We are calling it the Margaret Clifford House. Margaret's name first. It was her idea. After all, last month, all 3 children came to the island for the first time together. Not for any formal reason. Natalie had asked if she could see the property. Owen came because she called him. Dominic drove down separately and arrived 2 hours after the others. We walked the 6 acres in the late afternoon light, the 3 of them asking questions about the garden, the workshop, the structure of the cottage. Owen pointed out where the foundation might need attention down the track. Dominic asked about the truss structure with genuine curiosity rather than calculation. Natalie stood at the cliff edge for a long time looking at the strait. On the way back to the workshop, she fell into step beside me. She said she had been thinking about something Margaret had once told her when she was a teenager, that the measure of a person was not what they built when things were easy, but what they chose to repair when things were broken. She said she understood now that Margaret had been talking about more than architecture. I told her I thought she was right. We went inside and made dinner together in the small cottage kitchen. 4 people learning, late and imperfectly, how to be in a room without old weapons between them. The food was simple. The conversation was careful at first, and then less careful. And then at some point, Owen made a joke that was genuinely funny, and all 3 of them laughed in a way I had not heard since they were children. Margaret would have known that moment was coming. She planned for everything else. I think she planned for that too. I have spent a year now sitting with everything she built in silence. I have had time to think about what I might have done differently, and what I would tell anyone who found themselves where I was or where my stepchildren were. The cruelty we do inside families is rarely dramatic at first. It starts with a whispered thing, a small exclusion, a story that places someone outside the circle of what is owed, and because it happens incrementally, over years, inside the ordinary business of family life, it becomes invisible. The person it is done to often doubts their own reading of it. The people doing it often genuinely believe they are entitled to. What Margaret understood, and what took me much longer to see, is that silence is not the same as peace. She used silence as a tool because she had no better one. But silence allowed to accumulate without examination becomes a weight that eventually crushes whoever is standing underneath it. If you are the person being diminished, questioned, excluded, made to feel like a guest in your own life, find one person who is not part of the system you are living in, and tell them what is happening. Not to start a war, just to have a witness. Evidence matters. Records matter. The truth has more power than most people realize, but only if it is somewhere it can be found. If you are the person doing the diminishing, whether because someone older told you a story about who deserves what, or because fear of scarcity made you reach for more than you were owed, know that it is not too late to set it down. The cost of carrying it is higher than you think, and it does not end when the other person does. And if you are the person standing where Margaret stood, holding a terrible knowledge in order to protect someone you love, but wherever possible, find a way to let the protected person know they are being protected. Loneliness and love should not be the same experience. They do not have to be. Margaret is scattered now at the base of the cliffs on the island's southern edge, where the water is the loudest. On still evenings, I can hear the sound of it from the workshop veranda. I think of her as the architect she always was. Not of buildings, but of a future she would not live to see, but believed in. Absolutely. She drafted it in green binders, funded it from bonuses and careful patience, and left it in the hands of a man who had no idea it existed until the moment he needed it most. That is the most extraordinary act of love I have ever witnessed. It looked like cold distance for 40 years. It turned out to be the most attentive, determined, costly devotion I will ever know. I told her that once, out loud, standing at the cliffs on a morning last winter when the sky was doing something extraordinary over the strait. The wind came back off the water and I chose to take that as her answer. The Japanese maple in Baldwin is doing well, by the way. It has settled into the soil as though it intended to be there all along. In spring, it will be the color of something Margaret always loved and never quite got around to naming. I will sit beside it and I will know what it is called.